Hey guys, did you know Hitler's first political job wasn't as a leader, but as a spy? Before the parades, before the flags, before the war, he was just another ex-soldier, thin, unknown, and quietly bitter. Assigned by the army to keep tabs on fringe political groups, he attended meetings not as a speaker, but as an informant. His task was to take notes, observe, report. But something happened in one of those meetings. He didn't just listen, he stood up, spoke. And when he did, people listened. That single, unexpected moment would unravel the rest of the century. So how did a man who started as a nameless spy rewrite the rules of power? Tonight, we're going to follow that slow, quiet climb. Not the loud, violent parts you've seen in films, but the careful steps he took in silence. Through backroom meetings, through borrowed ideas, through fear and promise, and the strange, subtle art of telling a broken nation exactly what it wanted to hear. There were no fireworks, no instant takeover, just the steady rise of someone who understood how pain becomes belief, and how despair, when shaped carefully, becomes loyalty. As we drift into the past, let's untangle the rise of a man who didn't seize power overnight, but one whisper, one handshake, one promise at a time. Settle in, breathe deep. Let's begin. In the wake of Germany's surrender, the army still held sway, even as the Weimar Republic took root. They were wary of revolution, particularly from the left. So they sent informants to monitor every socialist, communist, and nationalist gathering they could find. In 1919, Hitler was assigned to attend a meeting of the German Workers' Party, a group so small it barely filled a back room. But something happened at that meeting. Not with the party, but within Hitler. He listened to the rhetoric, he noted the frustrations, and then, unprompted, he stood up and spoke. No notes, no plan, just a rising fury that seemed to take on a rhythm of its own. He talked about betrayal, about pride, about Germany's wounded honor, and people listened. He hadn't planned to join the party. But the party, impressed by his raw intensity, offered him a place. It was nothing grand, no money, no title. Just a card with his name on it, and the number 55 later, he would claim he was member number 7, an early sign of his obsession with myth-making. From then on, the beer halls became his battlefield. He trained himself to speak, studying crowd psychology, pacing, voice control, and timing. He experimented, learned when to raise his voice and when to lower it, when to point a finger, when to pause. He watched faces, learned which phrases made people nod, which made them cheer, which made them lean in, unconsciously drawn forward. He wasn't born a great orator. He built himself into one. Night after night, he returned to the beer halls, sometimes speaking to a dozen half-drunk men, other times to hundreds squeezed shoulder to shoulder, always with the same message. Germany had been betrayed, not by enemies abroad, but by enemies within. Politicians, communists, Jews. The crowd knew these names. They already hated these groups. He didn't introduce new ideas. He sharpened the ones they already held. And they listened. Because, in the chaos of post-war Germany, he made their anger feel organized, their fear feel rational, their humiliation feel like a wound that could be healed. If only the right man led the way. In 1921, Hitler took over the German Workers' Party, renaming it the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party. Its message wasn't consistent yet. It borrowed pieces from everywhere: nationalism, socialism, militarism, anti-Semitism. It wasn't a platform, it was a mirror, reflecting back the crowd's pain and promising revenge disguised as redemption. Still, the party remained small. To spread the message, Hitler created a paramilitary wing, the SA, or stormtroopers. They were brawlers, often veterans, armed with clubs and fists. Their job was to protect Nazi speakers, intimidate rivals, and stir chaos. They wore brown shirts, marched in formation, sang songs. They gave the movement a look, a sound, a spectacle. By 1923, Hitler thought the time had come to seize power. Inspired by Mussolini's March on Rome, he launched the beer hall putsch, a failed coup attempt in Munich. He stormed a rally, declared a national revolution, and tried to march his followers to power. It was a disaster. Police fired into the crowd. 16 Nazis were killed. Hitler was arrested. The movement seemed broken. But in prison, he found time and a new kind of power. He wrote Mein Kampf, part autobiography, part manifesto. He dictated it to Rudolf Hess, pacing his cell, rehearsing arguments, perfecting his mythology. He presented himself not as a failed revolutionary, but as a visionary unjustly silenced. The book didn't sell well at first, but it planted seeds. When Hitler was released, he returned to politics, wiser. He realized the mistake hadn't been ambition, it had been impatience. From that point forward, he would not seize power. He would earn it through elections, persuasion, and illusion. No more putsch, just slow, careful advancement. He rebuilt the Nazi Party, held massive rallies, gave speeches that now lasted hours, flowing from whisper to thunder and back again. He created a visual brand: flags, swastikas, uniforms, torches, everything choreographed. He gave people enemies to hate. But more than that, he gave them identity. To be German, he said, was not about passport or language. It was about blood, about destiny, about unity through struggle. As the Weimar Republic floundered, caught between economic collapse and parliamentary gridlock, Hitler's voice grew louder. Every crisis made him seem more prophetic. Every failure of democracy made his discipline look like strength. He promised jobs, order, pride, revenge. He spoke to the unemployed worker and the disillusioned veteran, to the angry student and the anxious shopkeeper. He never spoke down to anyone. He made every listener feel central to the movement, like they were part of history. And by 1933, the plan worked. He became chancellor, not by force, but through manipulated legality. And once inside, he moved quickly. Rights suspended, opponents jailed, press muzzled, laws rewritten. The man who began as a spy, quietly observing in a smoky beer hall, had taken the entire country with him. No fireworks, no sudden takeover. Just the slow, steady footsteps of a man who understood despair better than anyone else, and how to twist it into devotion. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, let your mind reflect not on the shouts and gunfire of war, but on the quieter sounds: the scratch of a pen in a prison cell, the hum of a radio in a family kitchen, the creak of a beer hall stool as a young man stands to speak. History doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it slips in slowly, one word at a time. Hitler didn't stand out at first. He was just another ex-soldier with strong opinions. But he studied the room carefully. He noticed what kept people listening. He saw how the best speakers moved from quiet facts to sudden outbursts of emotion. He practiced this himself. His early speeches weren't polished. Sometimes he stumbled over words. Sometimes his voice cracked from shouting. But he had a knack for sensing the crowd's mood. Picture a small hall with maybe 50 people, mostly men in worn-out coats. The air smells of beer and sweat. A speaker stands on a crate or table. He starts calmly, listing economic statistics. Then his voice rises. He pounds the table. He points fingers. He shouts about betrayal and injustice. Listeners who are slouching now sit upright. Some lean forward. Their faces change. Anger stirs in their expressions. Hitler learned to pause at just the right moments. He'd let silence hang after a shocking statement. Then he'd follow it with something even more provocative. He'd accuse politicians of treason. He'd blame Jews for Germany's problems. He'd promise vengeance against France and Britain. The crowd would erupt. People who barely knew each other suddenly felt united by shared fury. At one early meeting, an attendee recalled Hitler's strange effect on listeners. He began hesitantly, but then something happened. His words started flowing faster. His whole body shook. His voice rose to a scream. People gasped. Some cried, others shouted approval. I'd never seen anything like it. The beer hall setting mattered. Formal speeches in government buildings felt stiff and distant. But in a tavern, everything felt more personal. Speakers drank with the audience afterward. They shook hands and listened to complaints. Attendees felt heard, not just lectured. Topics varied. Some nights focused on the Treaty of Versailles. Other nights attacked communists or Jews. Always, the message was simple. Germany was innocent. Its troubles came from traitors within and enemies abroad. Only radical change could fix things. Only strong leaders could save the nation. Meetings often ended with singing. The Nazi anthem, the Horst Wessel song, became familiar in Munich's taverns. People raised beer steins as they sang. The lyrics spoke of blood and flags and marching toward dawn. Singing together deepened the emotional high. Attendees left feeling part of something bigger. Violence lurked at the edges. Brown shirts, Nazi paramilitaries guarded meetings. They brawled with communist groups. Bloody noses and black eyes were common. But several places welcomed the Nazis, especially when meetings drew crowds on slow weeknights. Hitler refined his techniques over hundreds of speeches. He learned to tailor his message for different audiences. To workers, he emphasized jobs and wages. To veterans, he spoke of wartime honor. To shopkeepers, he promised protection from communist looters. Hitler refined his techniques over hundreds of speeches. He learned to tailor his message for different audiences. To workers, he emphasized jobs and wages. To veterans, he spoke of wartime honor. To shopkeepers, he promised protection from communist looters. The core message stayed the same, but the packaging shifted. By 1922, Nazi meetings were drawing bigger crowds, sometimes 200 or more. People came partly for the spectacle. Fights might break out. Hecklers might storm the stage. Someone might fire a pistol in the air. It was unpredictable, and that made it exciting. The party also sold pamphlets and newspapers at meetings. Prices were low, 5 or 10 pfennigs. The print quality was poor, with smudged ink and cheap paper. But the headlines grabbed attention. Germany awake. The Jews are our misfortune. Readers carried these papers home, spreading ideas further. New members signed up after speeches. The process was simple. You gave your name and address, You paid small dues, just enough to fund the next meeting. You got a membership card. Some joined on impulse, caught up in the excitement. Others took weeks to decide. Slowly, connections formed between different beer hall groups. A carpenter might hear Hitler speak one week. The next week, he'd bring his brother-in-law, the butcher. The butcher might later invite co-workers. Chains of personal recommendation grew the movement far more effectively than posters or radio ever could. In November 1922, a major shift happened. Hitler spoke to a crowd of nearly 2,000 in Munich's Hofbräuhaus. Police reports noted the extraordinary energy in the room. People stood on tables to see better. Applause interrupted the speech dozens of times. Dozens of new members joined that night. Afterward, Hitler realized his small group tactics could work on larger scales. The beer hall years built habits that later defined Nazi rallies. The salute, originally just a practical gesture to signal silence in noisy rooms. The banners, first simple cloth signs hung behind speakers. The chanting, borrowed from drinking songs and army cadences. What began as improvisation became ritual. Financial backers took notice. Wealthy conservatives saw Hitler's ability to mobilize crowds. Some began donating modest sums, enough to rent larger venues or print more propaganda. The party's bank balance grew from a few hundred marks to thousands. Most Germans still had never heard of Hitler in 1923. But in Munich, especially among certain circles, his name carried weight. When he walked into a tavern, conversations hushed. Waiters brought him drinks without being asked. Bodyguards hovered nearby. These early gatherings explain much about Hitler's later rise. He didn't start with stadium rallies or radio broadcasts. He started in dimly lit rooms, convincing people one beer hall at a time. The personal touch mattered. Attendees didn't just hear speeches. They felt like participants in a movement. When economic crisis struck again in 1929, this groundwork paid off. The party had networks in dozens of cities, people who knew how to organize meetings, print leaflets, and stir passions. Years of practice made their tactics effective. The small gatherings also reveal something unsettling. Radical ideas rarely spread through books or lectures alone. They grow in places where emotion overrides reason, where anger feels communal, where simple answers sound convincing, where groups amplify shared grievances. Anger rarely starts suddenly. It builds slowly, like water heating in a pot. By 1925, Germany had endured 6 years of hardship. People needed someone to blame. They found it in two groups, Jews and communists. Neither group was large. Jews made up less than 1% of the population. But they became perfect targets. Newspapers printed lists of Jewish government workers. Cartoons showed hook-nosed bankers stealing money. Articles claimed Jewish lawyers tricked veterans out of pensions. When a Jewish foreign minister signed treaties, critics called it proof of international conspiracies. None of this was new. Germany had anti-Semitic traditions, but the tone grew sharper. Communists made an easier target. They openly wanted revolution. Conservatives feared losing their property. Middle-class shopkeepers hated Marxist calls to abolish private business. When strikes turned violent, newspapers blamed Bolshevik agitators. SA men beat up leftist speakers with little police interference. Psychologists call this scapegoating, pinning complex problems on simple targets. The Versailles Treaty was complicated. Inflation had multiple causes. Unemployment stemmed from global markets. But people preferred clear villains. Speakers who pointed fingers drew bigger crowds than those discussing global economics. Propaganda worked in small doses. A shopkeeper might see a poster claiming Jews owned all department stores. Next week, a speaker would mention Jewish store owners avoiding taxes. Soon the shopkeeper noticed more Jewish-sounding names above shops, names he'd never registered before. Hitler's speeches followed patterns. He'd start with legitimate complaints, high rents, corrupt politicians, unfair treaties. Then came the pivot. And who benefits from this? International Jewry. He never provided evidence. The connection was emotional, not logical. Crowds didn't need proof. They wanted catharsis. School textbooks changed slowly. A 1926 geography book listed the Jewish race as separate from Europeans. History books emphasized medieval persecutions of Germans by others. Teachers received pamphlets suggesting discussion questions. Why do Jews control so much business? The essay grew more brazen. They stood outside Jewish shops, discouraging customers. They painted slogans on walls. They disrupted synagogue services. Police reports show most officers did nothing, either from sympathy or indifference. Courts gave light sentences to SA men convicted of assault. Newspaper classified sections told a story. Jewish families placed ads seeking lost relatives abroad. Businesses announced Aryan ownership. Doctors added Christian practitioner to their listings. These weren't laws yet, just quiet adjustments to the mood. Violence increased in cycles. The SA would attack a leftist meeting. Communists would retaliate. Nazis would escalate. Soon, political clashes became routine. In 1927, Berlin witnessed 112 political riots in 6 months. People stopped noticing broken windows or bloody sidewalks. Most Germans weren't extremists, but ordinary people absorbed snippets. A factory worker might not join the Nazis, but he'd laugh at an anti-Jewish joke. A housewife might dislike violence, but she'd nod at complaints about Jewish bankers. Prejudice seeped in like damp, barely visible until the wood rotted. The Depression accelerated everything. By 193, 6 million were jobless. Competition for work made minorities targets. Unions reported bosses firing Jews first. Rumors spread that Jews hoarded food. No one produced evidence. Facts mattered less than feelings. Pamphlets appeared in mailboxes. Some showed well-dressed Jews next to begging veterans. Others listed Jewish department stores. The style was crude, but effective. One showed a vampire labeled International Finance sucking Germany's blood. All carried Nazi symbols. Children absorbed the mood. Schoolyard rhymes changed. Old folk songs got new, hostile verses. Toy stores sold board games where players captured Marxist looters. Youth groups taught that Jews manipulated stock markets. None of this came from school directives. It just spread. Scientific language gave prejudice respectability. Universities hosted race theory lectures. Museums displayed skull measurements, proving Aryan superiority. These events drew small crowds, but their influence spread. Doctors discussed racial hygiene. Lawyers debated restricting inferior immigrants. Jewish groups tracked the changes. Their newspapers listed incidents, a boycott here, a beating there. They petitioned the government. Officials expressed concern but took little action. One minister called it temporary unrest. Jewish leaders debated whether to stay or emigrate. Many stayed, believing Germany would recover its decency. SA violence became systematic. They kept files on Jewish businesses. They recorded which cafes hosted leftists. They practiced street fighting with actual raids, attacking socialist newspaper offices or union halls. Police often arrived late. Legal harassment increased. Towns passed laws banning Jewish ritual slaughter. Landlords evicted Jewish tenants using obscure clauses. Courts allowed these actions. When Jewish groups protested, officials claimed they were enforcing neutral laws. The Catholic and Protestant churches mostly stayed silent. Some clergy even endorsed Nazi candidates, seeing them as anti-communist defenders. A few pastors spoke against racism, but their sermons avoided politics, sticking to abstract morality. Foreign Jews noticed the shift. American visitors wrote home about hostile glances. British diplomats reported worsening conditions. But foreign governments took no action. Germany's troubles seemed internal. International press coverage focused on economics, not prejudice. Middle-class Germans experienced milder effects. A dentist might find his Jewish colleague denied clinic privileges. A teacher might be told not to recommend Jewish books. Small exclusions added up, all officially deniable. Communist tactics worsened the situation. Their militants also attacked opponents. Their newspapers mocked religion. Their calls for revolution scared moderates into Nazi arms. Both extremes fed each other. Violence from one justified crackdowns. Weimar Germany had 20 different governments in 14 years. No coalition lasted long. Parties argued over everything: tax rates, welfare cuts, foreign policy. Chancellors resigned monthly. President Hindenburg ruled by emergency decree more often than by law. Article 48 of the Constitution allowed this. A clause meant for crises became routine. Between 1930 and 1932, Hindenburg signed 60 emergency decrees. The Reichstag passed only 29 laws in the same period. Democracy wasn't functioning. It was limping along. People stopped expecting stability. Newspapers joked about cabinet shuffles. Politicians formed alliances one day, betrayed each other the next. Voters grew tired of the chaos. The Nazis offered simple solutions: one leader, one party, no arguments. Their posters showed strongmen lifting Germany from the mud. Their speeches promised action, not debate. To exhausted citizens, dictatorship started to sound efficient. Then came the Reichstag fire. On February 27, 1933, flames engulfed the Parliament building. A Dutch communist named Marinus van der Lubbe was caught inside. He confessed to setting the fire alone. The Nazis claimed it was a communist plot. Historians still debate the truth. What mattered was the reaction. The next day, Hindenburg signed the Reichstag fire decree. It suspended civil rights. No free speech, no free press, no privacy. Police could arrest without charge. The decree would last 12 years. Mass arrests began immediately. Over 4,000 communists went to jails and makeshift camps. SA units conducted raids without warrants. Newspapers criticizing the government were shut down. Courts approved the measures, citing national emergency. Few politicians objected. The Social Democrats tried, but their voices were drowned out. Most Germans accepted the restrictions as necessary. After all, communists had burned the Reichstag. Extreme times required extreme measures. Hitler moved next to legalize his power. The Enabling Act required a two-thirds Reichstag majority. He got it through intimidation and deals. SA men lined the streets outside the vote. Opponents received death threats. The Catholic Center Party agreed after Hitler promised to protect their schools. When the roll call happened on March 23, 1933, only the Social Democrats voted no. The act passed 444 to 94. Democracy voted itself out of existence. The Enabling Act let Hitler pass laws without parliament. It also let him change the Constitution. He used this power immediately. Within months, Germany became a one-party state. Trade unions were abolished. All other political parties were banned. State governments lost their independence. The Nazis didn't seize power. They were voted into it, then used legal tools to keep it. Judges helped the process. They accepted Nazi arguments about national revival. Few protested when laws targeted Jews or leftists. The Supreme Court approved concentration camps as legal preventative detention. Professional organizations expelled Jewish members willingly. Doctors and lawyers cleaned their own ranks. Civil servants signed loyalty oaths without complaint. The system wasn't overthrown. It complied. New laws came in rapid succession. The civil service law banned Jews from government jobs. The editor's law made journalists state employees. The hereditary farm law prevented land sales to non-Germans. Each measure targeted specific groups while leaving most citizens unaffected. People could tell themselves the rules didn't apply to them. Until the rules did. Propaganda softened the reality. Joseph Goebbels orchestrated the message. Germany was healing, prospering, becoming great again. Newspapers ran stories about new jobs and community spirit. The 1936 Olympics showed a modern, peaceful nation. Foreign reporters praised Hitler's economic progress. The darker policies stayed in the background. Opposition became impossible step by step. First, communists were outlawed, then socialists, then centrist parties. By 1934, even conservative critics fell silent. The Night of the Long Knives purged Hitler's rivals within the Nazi Party itself. Over 80 people were executed, including former allies like Ernst Röhm. Hindenburg thanked Hitler afterwards. The army swore loyalty. Resistance seemed futile when even the powerful couldn't resist. Local officials adapted to the new order. Mayors hung Nazi flags. Teachers added ideology to lessons. Shopkeepers displayed Germans-only signs. No single order mandated these changes. People acted voluntarily, anticipating what the regime wanted. This self-coordination made the takeover seamless. The state didn't have to command. It merely suggested, and citizens complied. The church's response showed how far normalization went. Some pastors opposed Nazi racism. Most stayed silent or collaborated. The Protestant church merged with Nazi ideology, creating a German Christian movement. They removed the Old Testament for being too Jewish. Catholic leaders signed a concordat with Hitler, protecting their institutions in exchange for non-interference in politics. Faith became another tool of control. Peacetime censorship paved the way for wartime lies. The Ministry of Public Enlightenment dictated newspaper content. Radio stations played Hitler's speeches on loop. Book burnings removed un-German ideas from libraries. Film studios produced propaganda disguised as entertainment. By controlling information, the regime shaped reality itself. people did know what they weren't told. Economically, the system worked for many. Unemployment dropped from 6 million to almost zero by 1936. Public works projects rebuilt infrastructure. The Autobahn became a symbol of progress. Wages stabilized. The brown shirts appeared first, not in mass numbers, but in twos and threes. By 1926, the Sturmabteilung, or SA, had formal uniforms. Brown shirts, black ties, high boots. The color choice was practical. After World War I, Germany had warehouses full of colonial uniforms meant for Africa. Tan fabric that didn't sell well. The Nazis bought them cheap. The brown fabric became synonymous with their movement. At first, people laughed. The outfit seemed ridiculous. Grown men playing soldier. But laughter faded as their numbers grew. The SA reached 70,000 members by 1931. They marched in tight formations through working-class neighborhoods. The rhythmic stomp of boots created an echo between buildings. Residents peeked through curtains, but rarely protested. Better to ignore them, most thought. The marches weren't technically illegal. Uniforms serve psychological functions. Researchers later found they reduce individual thinking. A person in uniform acts as part of a group, not as themselves. The SA understood this instinctively. Members received strict grooming standards, short hair, clean shaves, polished boots. The rules created conformity. An SA man ceased being Karl or Johann. He became part of something larger. Violence followed the uniforms. SA squads targeted left-wing bars and union offices. They used specific tactics, arriving just before closing time when patrons were tired, surrounding buildings to block exits, attacking in synchronized groups. Victims described the eerie discipline. The brown shirts rarely spoke during beatings. The silence made it more terrifying. Night raids became common. A Jewish shop owner in Nuremberg described waking to the sound of shattering glass. By the time he reached his storefront, the attackers were gone. Just broken windows and brown-shirted backs disappearing around a corner. Police often arrived hours later, if at all. Reports listed the incidents as property damage, without mentioning politics. The public reaction was complicated. Some Germans approved. Business owners liked that the SA broke up communist meetings. Others found the violence distasteful but necessary. As one Dresden teacher wrote in his diary, "I don't care for their methods, but someone must keep order." Most just adapted. Pedestrians crossed streets to avoid SA patrols. Parents told children to come home before dark. The uniforms created plausible deniability. When questioned about violence, Nazi leaders shrugged. How could they control every over-enthusiastic member? The SA was a volunteer organization, not an official party wing. This fiction persisted even as SA ranks swelled to 400,000 by 1932. The brown shirts weren't rogue elements. They were the party's muscle. Social rituals reinforced group identity. SA units held nightly meetings where they sang, drank, and listened to political speeches. New members received blood certificates after their first brawl, signed documents proving they'd fought for the cause. The certificates became prized possessions. Men framed them in their homes. The SA's leader, Ernst Röhm, encouraged a cultish atmosphere. He implemented homoerotic initiation rites, naked wrestling, group showers, strict physical fitness tests. Röhm himself was openly gay, an unusual fact the Nazis tolerated because of his usefulness. The rituals bound men together through shared humiliation and triumph. By 1933, the uniforms were omnipresent. SA men directed traffic at Nazi rallies. They guarded polling stations during elections. They stood outside Jewish businesses, discouraging customers. The brown shirts signaled that Nazis controlled public spaces, even before they officially did. Passers-by noted how SA men never seemed to work normal jobs. They were always present, always watching. The psychological effect was cumulative. When people see uniforms daily, they start seeing them as part of the landscape. A 1932 Berlin police report noted that SA violence generated fewer complaints than similar crimes by plainclothes gangs. The uniforms lent an air of legitimacy, however false. Clothing choices mattered. The Nazis carefully distinguished between uniforms. The black-clad SS were elite enforcers. The brown shirts were street fighters. Regular party members wore civilian clothes with armbands. This hierarchy created aspirations. Many brown shirts dreamed of earning black uniforms. The system kept them competing for approval. The SA, or Sturmabteilung, reached its height in 1934, swelling to over 3 million members. These brown shirts filled streets, rally grounds, and beer halls, a powerful, visible force of the Nazi movement. Yet, just as their power peaked, the tides turned sharply against them. Then came the infamous Night of the Long Knives. Under the cover of darkness, Adolf Hitler turned on his own stormtroopers. The SS, a smaller but more ruthless group loyal directly to Hitler, rounded up and executed Ernst Röhm, the SA's leader, along with hundreds of other SA officials. The charges were mostly fabricated, but the practical reasons were clear. The SA had grown too strong, too independent, and Röhm threatened Hitler's absolute control. This brutal purge was not just about power. It was a chilling message. Not even wearing the uniform guaranteed safety. After that violent night, the SA remained, but only as a shadow of its former self. Members kept their iconic brown shirts, but their political influence and violent authority faded. The SS took over as the dominant paramilitary force, feared and fiercely loyal to Hitler alone. Yet the brown uniforms endured. For some former SA men, joining the SS was a welcome promotion. For others, the demotion bred quiet resentment. But dissent was dangerous, and obedience was demanded above all else. The phenomenon of uniforms spread quickly throughout Nazi Germany. By 1935, almost every Nazi-affiliated group had its own distinctive outfit. The Hitler Youth wore brown shirts, the League of German Girls donned blue dresses, and even toddler groups had tiny, miniature uniforms. These clothes did more than cover bodies. They created clear, visible tribal lines. At a glance, you could identify a person's loyalties and social role. Research decades later helps explain why uniforms had such power. Psychologists found that people tend to see uniformed groups as more unified and committed than they might actually be. An individual brown shirt might privately question Nazi ideology, but the uniform he wore sent a clear message to himself and to others that he belonged fully to the cause. This created a self-reinforcing cycle. Treated as a true believer, he acted like one. Uniforms also shaped how outsiders perceived Nazi violence. A secret 1938 study by anti-Nazi academics found that ordinary Germans often underestimated the brutality of Nazi actions when those committing them wore matching uniforms. The same act Say, shutting down a Jewish-owned shop felt official, lawful, and acceptable when done by men in coordinated attire. The uniforms transformed acts of intimidation and bullying into state policy, normalized and sanitized. By 1939, the brown shirts had largely become ceremonial. They marched in parades, collected donations, and helped organize rallies. Their days as street fighters and terrorizers were over, now overtaken by the SS's deadly efficiency. Still, their legacy lingered. The SA's journey, from a group mocked and underestimated to a feared paramilitary force, showed how quickly symbols can gain power. A simple brown shirt went from laughable costume to emblem of terror in less than a decade. But the lesson isn't about fabric or fashion. It's about perception and presence. The SA didn't win hearts and minds with superior arguments or noble ideas. They won by being everywhere, visible, unavoidable, constant. Seeing those brown shirts daily made Nazism feel inevitable, unstoppable, and already deeply rooted. Modern historians often ask why more Germans didn't resist sooner. Part of the answer lies in the power of those uniforms. Resistance demands recognizing tyranny as abnormal and unacceptable. But when streets fill with brown shirts, that abnormality begins to feel normal. At first, you ignore them. Then, you tolerate them. Eventually, you rely on them, whether for safety, order, or out of fear. And by then, it's often too late. Today, the brown shirts are gone. Their uniforms survive only in museums, faded, fragile, and worn. The fabric feels coarse and cheap, rough wool, poorly dyed. But once, these simple clothes cast long, dark shadows. Those shadows did not vanish when the men who wore them did. They lingered in minds and memories, shaping what people believed was possible, and what was terrifyingly unavoidable. Uniforms don't create loyalty. They reveal it. And once revealed, that loyalty becomes a trap. Men who joined the SA for free meals or camaraderie found themselves bound to something larger. The jacket they put on casually became harder to remove with each passing year. Eventually, it wasn't clothing anymore. It was identity. Tonight, as you rest, consider how thin the line is between fabric and fate, between a shirt and a skin, between dressing up and becoming. The SA didn't realize they were sewing their own futures into those uniforms. By the time they did, the threads were too tight to cut. Sleep comes easier when we believe choices remain open. But history shows how quickly options narrow, how casually a person can dress themselves into a corner. The brown shirts are a caution not about uniforms, but about steps, about how small commitments to a color, a group, an idea, accumulate into something inescapable. No one joins something they think will trap them. Yet traps need no grand design, just daily, quiet acceptance. One button at a time. The night is quiet now. The uniforms are stored away. But the lesson remains, silent as shadows. Belonging always costs something, sometimes more than we intend to pay. Rest well. Tomorrow's choices will wait for morning. For now, just breathe. Just be. The past can't hurt you here. Let the weight of history settle gently, like a coat being shrugged off after a long day. It's okay to set it down. Okay to rest. Tomorrow will come soon enough. Until then, there's just this moment. In 1933, a new object began appearing in German storefronts and household catalogs. It was modest in size, priced at just 76 Reichsmarks, about 2 weeks' wages for a factory worker. It came in a brown Bakelite case with just a few controls. an on-off switch, a volume knob, and a tuning dial with a subtle but critical limitation. It was locked to domestic frequencies. Its name was simple, friendly, even patriotic, the Volksempfänger, or People's Receiver. On the surface, it seemed like a technological gift, sleek, affordable, modern. But it wasn't just a radio. It was an idea, a silent partner in the Nazi regime's greatest ambition, not only to control the country's borders, but its thoughts. Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, understood this better than anyone. Radio, he declared, is the most modern and most important instrument for influencing the masses. And he meant it. No regime in history had ever possessed a tool quite like this. An invisible tether that could reach into every living room, kitchen, and bedroom, every morning and night, without resistance, without effort. By 1939, over 70% of German households owned a Volksempfänger. That wasn't coincidence. It was by design. The government subsidized production, keeping prices low. Monthly installment plans made it possible even for the working poor. The radio, like the regime itself, was designed to feel inevitable. And it did. In thousands of homes across Germany, the People's Receiver was placed with care and pride. On a kitchen shelf, surrounded by spices and recipe books. On a sideboard in the parlor, beside framed photographs and decorative vases. In children's bedrooms, playing fairy tales and lullabies that ended, without exception, with a patriotic flourish. It didn't feel intrusive. Not at first. On any ordinary evening, the family might gather around after dinner. Children might stretch out on the rug. A mother might mend a sleeve, her fingers moving rhythmically as music filled the room. A father might sip tea or read the paper as the announcer's voice drifted from the speaker. The radio wasn't there to command. It was there to comfort, to entertain, to inform, or so it seemed. What most listeners didn't notice, or chose not to, was that every program, whether it was a weather report, a folk music concert, or a story for children, began with the same unmistakable sound, a triumphant brass fanfare, the Nazi anthem swelling with orchestral precision. It was more than an opening tune. It was a ritual, a signal, a reminder. The music would fade and the voice would follow, always the same tone, calm, confident, assured. Sometimes it was a policy update, other times a warning, a celebration, a promise. But it was never optional. Skipping the message meant turning off the radio entirely, losing both the voice of the Führer and the comfort of entertainment. This was not an accident. It was part of a larger choreography, one that blurred lines between life and loyalty, between culture and control. Over time, people stopped noticing the anthem. It simply became part of the atmosphere, like church bells or a clock tower chime. Children hummed the tune without thinking. Housewives turned up the volume out of habit. And slowly, the propaganda embedded itself, not through force, but through familiarity. The radio didn't shout at first. It whispered. The broadcasts were carefully balanced. 1 hour, a passionate speech. The next, a cheerful polka. A segment on agricultural practices. A short story written by a local school child. The airwaves were filled with small comforts, and in between them, subtle shifts in language. A new phrase repeated, an enemy defined, a doubt sown, a fear confirmed. Many listeners didn't realize how much they had come to rely on the radio, not just for news, but for meaning. It gave their days structure. It gave their emotions direction. It told them who to trust and whom to fear. There were no sudden commands, no direct orders, just an ongoing current of reassurance and repetition. Germany is rising. The Führer is wise. The enemy is near. But all will be well, so long as you obey. And the radio kept playing. In rural towns, farmers listened between milking cows and feeding pigs. In city apartments, shopkeepers tuned in before opening their doors. In classrooms, teachers wheeled in receivers for group listening. Even hospitals and factories were wired with speakers. The voice of the state was everywhere, ubiquitous, unquestioned, and it worked. Not because it was loud, but because it was constant. By the late 1930s, the Volksempfänger had accomplished what no other communication device ever had. It had synchronized a nation's thoughts, not with force, but with rhythm. Not with arguments, but with presence. When something is heard enough, it no longer needs to be believed. It simply becomes normal. The design of the radio reinforced this philosophy. It had no shortwave capacity, meaning foreign broadcasts couldn't be heard. It had no headphone jack, preventing private listening. It was a communal device for communal thinking. You heard what the regime allowed, and nothing more. But the real genius, the real danger, wasn't the hardware. It was the tone. The voice coming through the speaker didn't demand. It guided, it didn't accuse. It assured me. It didn't rage. It comforted. And in doing so, it bypassed the walls of skepticism and slipped directly into routine. Over time, it became harder to distinguish between truth and familiarity. If a message was repeated enough, if it was delivered kindly enough, if it came with music and weather reports and lullabies, how could it possibly be wrong? That was the quiet power of the people's receiver. It didn't conquer by shouting. It conquered by whispering and never stopping. Wireless technology was still in its infancy during the early 1930s. In many German homes, silence still ruled the evenings. Music came from gramophones, news from newspapers, and public conversation from town squares. But then came the radio. At first, it felt like a novelty, a modern marvel buzzing with potential. But to the Nazi regime, it wasn't merely an invention. It was a gateway, a portal into every German home, every ear, every mind. For many citizens, their very first experience of radio wasn't private. It was communal. Public listening events were organized by the Nazi Party as early as 1933. These weren't spontaneous gatherings. They were carefully staged affairs held in places that felt familiar. Pubs, school halls, community centers, barns. Speakers were placed high, the signal amplified, and wooden benches arranged in neat rows. Posters were pinned, flags were hung. Everyone was welcome, but attendance was quietly tracked. It started as curiosity, but very quickly it became expectation. Party officials and local leaders kept mental lists of who showed up, and more importantly, who didn't. Not attending became suspicious. Neighbors might talk. Rumors might spread. Were you uninterested in the future of Germany? Did you have something to hide? These events blurred the line between community and compliance. People went not just to listen, but to be seen listening. Even those who privately distrusted the party learned to nod at the right moments, to clap on cue. Dissent was risky. Silence was safest. Over time, the broadcasts became a social ritual, one that felt less about information and more about performance. And so, many Germans chose a quieter alternative. They bought radios of their own. To encourage this shift, the Nazi regime launched a massive effort to make radio ownership affordable, even for working-class families. The Volksempfänger, or People's Receiver, was introduced. It was small, simple, and state-approved. No shortwave reception, and no foreign broadcasts. Just one voice. Theirs. And for just 5 Reichsmarks a month, anyone could bring it home. Installment plans were made easy. Interest rates were low. Factory workers, clerks, farmers, and even housemaids could afford them. By 1939, over 70% of German households owned a radio, the highest ratio in the world at the time. The state didn't just want listeners, it wanted every listener. Once inside the home, the radio never truly turned off. Even when the dial was silent, its presence remained. It occupied space on the mantel, on the kitchen shelf, on the bedside table. A constant reminder. And when it spoke, it did so with absolute authority. Whether you agreed or not became irrelevant. The message still entered the room, still hung in the air. For many families, the daily schedule began to revolve around the broadcast. Meals were planned around speeches. Chores were paused during announcements. Children were told to quiet down when the Führer was speaking. In time, it became unthinkable to challenge what came out of that little box. It didn't feel like propaganda. It felt like reality. Familiar, routine, and unchanging. Even the technical design of the People's Receiver reflected its purpose. It had no headphone jack, no auxiliary ports, no tuning for foreign channels. It was intentionally limited, engineered to isolate the German public from outside ideas. It was, in effect, a one-way mirror. You could see the world the regime wanted you to see, but not beyond it. And so, bit by bit, house by house, the Nazi voice embedded itself into the private lives of millions. There was no moment of sudden indoctrination, no mass awakening, just gradual exposure. Like sunlight filtering through curtains, the voice of the state crept softly into minds already dulled by economic hardship, national shame, and the desire for belonging. And the more it was heard, the more it felt like truth. This was the genius and the danger of mass communication in its earliest form. The Nazi regime didn't need to force the radio into people's homes. It only needed to make people want it, then believe it, and finally depend on it. In those early years, few could see what was happening. Fewer still had the means or courage to resist. After all, it wasn't soldiers at the door. It wasn't laws being shouted. It was just a voice, confident, familiar, ever-present. It arrived with music. It brought the weather. It announced births and deaths, songs and recipes. It felt like a friend, a neighbor, a background hum. But behind the voice, behind the polished brass fanfare and warm greetings, was a cold intention. Obedience, control. A nation not just united, but synchronized. Programming followed strict patterns. Morning shows featured patriotic music. Afternoon segments taught Nazi-approved history. Evening broadcasts carried Hitler's speeches. Sandwiched between were hymns, folk tales, and light entertainment. Enough variety to keep listeners tuned in. Goebbels' ministry reviewed every script. Jokes couldn't mock authority. Songs couldn't mention jazz. Talk shows avoided controversial topics. The goal wasn't just to spread propaganda. It was to make Nazi viewpoints seem like common sense. Foreign radio was banned in 1939, but Germans had already stopped listening. Jamming signals blocked BBC broadcasts. Owning a short-wave radio required police permission. Most Volksempfänger couldn't pick up foreign stations anyway. The government issued radios with preset tuning to prevent adjustments. Neighborhood wardens checked antennas to ensure they pointed toward German transmitters. Propaganda worked best when disguised. Radio plays depicted Jewish characters as criminals, not in obvious ways, but through suggestive dialogue. A shopkeeper might complain about those people ruining business. A mother might warn daughters about foreign elements. Listeners absorbed stereotypes without realizing it. Children especially mimicked what they heard on radio dramas, repeating phrases at school and playgrounds. Some programs targeted specific groups. Farmers heard about Nazi agricultural policies during weather forecasts. Housewives learned thrift tips that subtly supported wartime rationing. Even music carried messages. Marches played more often than love songs, folk tunes over modern dances. The selection seemed natural, as if German culture naturally favored these sounds. Signing off became ritual. Evening broadcasts ended with the same phrase. Das ganze Deutschland hört den Führer mit dem Volksempfänger. All Germany hears the Führer on the people's radio. The words reinforced unity and obedience. Families listening in private homes became part of a national audience, all receiving identical information at the same moment. The effect was subtle but powerful. Neighbors who once debated politics now repeated radio talking points. Those with doubts heard no opposing views to validate them. Isolated dissenters assumed they alone questioned the regime. Psychologists later called this pluralistic ignorance, when individuals wrongly believe their private thoughts differ from public consensus. Radio also reshaped language itself. Nazi terms entered daily speech through constant repetition. Volk, people. Schädling, pest. Lebensraum, living space. Children used them without understanding origins. Housewives incorporated them into shopping lists. The words carried assumptions that Germans deserved more land, that outsiders threatened purity, that the Führer embodied national will. Special programs targeted youth. The Führer Speaks to You aired after school. Young announcers used casual slang to explain Nazi ideals. Adventure serials featured Hitler youth characters solving mysteries and defeating villains, always foreigners or communists. Children could join fan clubs, collect pins, even write letters to favorite radio heroes. By 1938, Germans averaged 4 hours of daily radio listening. The habit crossed class lines. Factory workers heard the same content as bankers. Regional differences faded as dialects gave way to standardized broadcasts. A farmer in Bavaria and a shopkeeper in Hamburg could discuss last night's speech with shared familiarity. Mass media created mass culture, carefully filtered. The radios had hidden costs. Electricity bills rose for poor families. Some skipped meals to pay for licenses. But complaints stayed private. Wives feared husbands might report discontent. Children snitched on parents who criticized broadcasts. The radios in their homes became not just entertainment, but surveillance. A reminder that someone might always be listening. Goebbels understood radio's intimate power. Print required literacy. Film needed theaters. Radio entered homes directly, speaking like a familiar guest. He scheduled Hitler's speeches during dinner hours when families would gather around the device. The Führer's voice became background noise to daily life, always present, increasingly unquestioned. When war came in 1939, radio mobilized the nation faster than any army order. Announcements interrupted programs with victory bulletins, air raid warnings, and stirring calls to duty. The soothing voices of entertainers were replaced with the stern clarity of command. In living rooms across the world, people didn't just hear the war. They felt it through every static-laced broadcast. In 1933, a new after-school activity appeared across Germany. The Hitler Youth offered hiking trips, campfires, and sports. Parents saw it as harmless fun, a way for children to get fresh air and exercise. Membership wasn't mandatory at first, but by 1936, it became the only legal youth group. Traditional scouting organizations dissolved. Church youth clubs closed. The Hitler Youth grew from 50,000 members in 1933 to over 7 million by 1939. What began as extracurricular became inescapable. The appeal was deliberate. Uniforms made children feel important. Ranks and badges offered achievements to earn. Summer camps featured swimming and archery. Winter trips included sledding and snowball fights. Parents appreciated the structure. Many were too busy surviving the Depression to organize activities themselves. The program provided free childcare with patriotic benefits. Who could object to children learning discipline and teamwork? Slowly, the focus shifted. Games became paramilitary training. Treasure hunts taught map reading for combat. Knot-tying exercises prepared boys to tie prisoners. Girls practiced first aid, not for playground scrapes, but battlefield wounds. Songs around campfires weren't folk tunes anymore. Lyrics praised Hitler and promised death to Jews. Parents who noticed the changes often dismissed them. War games seemed like normal boyhood behavior. The songs were just words. Schools reinforced the messaging. Textbooks included math problems like, if a mentally ill person costs the state 4 marks per day, how much would 300,000 cost over 10 years? Biology lessons taught racial purity. History classes blamed Jews for Germany's defeat in World War I. Teachers who resisted were fired. Those who complied received bonuses. Children learned to view dissent as disloyalty. Report cards included grades for attitude toward National Socialism. The Hitler Youth demanded increasing time. Weekly meetings became bi-weekly, then daily. School schedules adjusted to accommodate drills. Children arrived home exhausted, repeating slogans they barely understood. Parents who complained risked visits from social workers. One mother recalled her son coming home with bruises from boxing training. When she asked him to quit, he replied, "But mother, I must learn to be hard." He was 9. Loyalty metrics were carefully tracked. Leaders recorded attendance at rallies. They noted who sang loudest during anthems. Children earned points for bringing friends to meetings. The most enthusiastic members received special privileges, better camp assignments, trips to Nuremberg, sometimes personal meetings with Nazi officials. The system rewarded conformity visibly and consistently. Peer pressure did the rest. By 1938, the program reached into homes. Children were encouraged to report un-German behavior. A father listening to foreign radio, a mother criticizing rationing, a neighbor reading banned books, all became grounds for denunciation. Some children turned in their own parents. Courts often took their testimony over adults. The program didn't just teach obedience. It reversed traditional authority. The state became the true parent. The effects became visible quickly. Teenagers stopped celebrating Christmas, calling it a Jewish holiday. They refused to attend church with their families. Some even changed their names, rejecting non-Germanic ones given at baptism. Teachers reported children correcting parents' political comments at dinner tables. Indoctrination techniques were systematic. Repetition made slogans automatic. The Jews are our misfortune. Germany must live, even if we must die. Role-playing games cast children as soldiers defending the fatherland. Rituals created emotional bonds. Flag ceremonies at dawn, torchlight processions at night. Summer camps isolated children from outside influences for weeks. The combination worked. By 1939, psychological surveys showed Hitler Youth members scoring higher on obedience scales than any previous generation. The program also targeted specific demographics. Rural children received free train tickets to cities, exposing them to Nazi rallies. Urban youth got countryside trips to connect with blood and soil ideology. Working-class boys found status through uniforms their families couldn't afford otherwise. Middle-class children earned prestige through academic competitions with Nazi themes. Every subgroup found reasons to stay engaged. Parents faced impossible choices. Withdrawing children meant social isolation. The Hitler Youth controlled all youth activities. Non-member children couldn't join sports teams, attend dances, or sometimes even find playmates. Some families tried subtle resistance, claiming illnesses, scheduling conflicting activities. But persistent absence brought visits from officials. One father was arrested for undermining youth morale after keeping his son home to help with harvest. The outbreak of war accelerated the process. Teenage boys delivered draft notices to their own fathers. Girls as young as 12 staffed anti-aircraft searchlights. Children collected scrap metal and knitted socks for soldiers. The Hitler Youth became a homefront militia. By 1943, some units were fighting on front lines. The youngest recipient of the Iron Cross was 12. Post-war studies revealed the damage. A generation struggled with guilt, for denouncing neighbors, for abandoning families, for believing lies. Some couldn't recall why they'd been so fervent. The memories blurred together. Campfires and propaganda, friendship and fanaticism. Many remembered the fun while forgetting the indoctrination until confronted with old song lyrics or diary entries. The program's success lay in its gradualness. No child joined to become a soldier. They signed up for camping trips and left as ideologues. The transformation happened slowly enough that each step seemed reasonable. Singing one song led to learning another. Attending one rally led to attending 10. Small commitments built into unshakable loyalty. By the time parents realized what was happening, their children belonged more to the state than to them. Today's playgrounds look different. Children wear different uniforms for different teams. They chant different cheers at different games. The surface has changed. The underlying psychology remains. Young minds still seek belonging. They still respond to rewards. They still confuse group identity with personal truth. The methods may be gentler now, but the potential is always there, waiting for anyone who understands how easily curiosity can be steered, how quickly games can become training, how innocently childhood can be weaponized. The night is quiet now, Schoolyards stand empty. Notebooks are closed. Today's children sleep safely, unaware of how close their grandparents came to losing themselves in someone else's story. The past doesn't repeat, but it leaves blueprints. The real lesson isn't about 1935's Germany. It's about how thin the line always is between education and indoctrination, between play and preparation, between guiding children and grooming them. The shadows linger, not as ghosts, but as reminders that innocence is fragile and trust is easily misplaced. Sleep comes easier when the lessons are learned, when the dangers are named, when the children are safe in their beds, dreaming their own dreams, at least for tonight. Rest now. Tomorrow's lessons can wait until morning. History never really repeats, but sometimes it hums a familiar tune. The 1930s feel distant. Brown shirts and radio speeches and children's marches. Yet certain rhythms keep returning, softer now, but recognizable if you listen closely. Economic anxiety still fractures societies. People still crave simple answers to complex problems. Leaders still learn how to weaponize discontent. The pieces don't reassemble exactly, but the patterns remain. Weimar Germany didn't vanish. It just changed costumes and waited for its next performance. Consider economic stress first. Germany's hyperinflation seems extreme, but the feeling behind it isn't. When people lose jobs or savings, they grow desperate. Desperation makes radical ideas sound reasonable. Today, inflation rises globally. Housing costs squeeze families. Wages stagnate while profits soar. The details differ, but the anxiety feels similar. People don't riot over economic theories. They protest when they can't feed their children. That raw anger always seeks somewhere. Politics mirrors this tension. Weimar had countless parties constantly bickering. Modern democracies face similar fragmentation. Multi-party systems struggle to form stable governments. Elected officials spend more time attacking rivals than solving problems. Public trust erodes year by year. The center weakens while extremes grow louder. Historians note that authoritarianism rarely conquers democracy. It exploits democracy's failures. When people lose faith in the system, they risk accepting anyone who promises to break it. Extremist rhetoric adapts to new eras, but keeps old templates. Listen to modern demagogues, and you'll hear echoes. They're stealing our jobs replaces Jewish conspiracy. Fake news substitutes for lying press. The targets change: immigrants, elites, globalists. But the technique stays the same. Identify enemies, assign blame, promise vengeance. Studies show that authoritarian language follows predictable patterns. Simplistic dichotomies, us versus them. Exaggerated threats, invasion, replacement. Claims of victimhood, persecuted majority. The words shift, but the manipulation remains. Psychologists identify warning signs, behavioral markers that precede democratic collapse. One is othering language, where opponents become subhuman. Another is celebrating violence as legitimate political expression. A third is attacking the integrity of elections themselves. Sound familiar? These don't guarantee dictatorship, but they grease its path. The 1930s showed how quickly norms dissolve once leaders normalize these tactics. Today, cameras replace radios, tweets substitute for speeches, but the underlying playbook endures. Focus groups in the 1930s revealed something unsettling. Most Nazi supporters didn't join for ideology. They wanted jobs, security, national pride. The hatred came later. after they'd already pledged loyalty. Modern surveys show similar trends. People often back strongmen for practical reasons, only gradually absorbing their prejudices. This is how authoritarianism spreads, not by converting true believers, but by convincing ordinary people that stability justifies compromise. The trade starts small. Overlook some racism for lower gas prices. Tolerate some corruption for border security. By the time the full cost is clear, it's too late to protest. Propaganda has evolved, yet its essence persists. Social media algorithms act like the Volksempfänger, curating information to reinforce beliefs. Facebook groups mimic beer halls, spaces where fringe ideas amplify among like-minded people. Viral misinformation serves the same role as Nazi tabloids, just faster. Studies show falsehood spreads 6 times quicker than truth online. Why? Because lies often satisfy emotional needs better than facts. When people feel afraid or angry, they share what validates those feelings, not what challenges them. Youth indoctrination takes subtler forms now, but still exists. Certain governments manipulate school curricula to glorify the past and vilify outsiders. Summer camps teach children militarized patriotism. Video games reward nationalist fantasies. The methods modernize, but the goal stays constant. Capture young minds before critical thinking develops. One survey found that children in authoritarian-leaning countries could more easily identify propaganda techniques because they'd seen so many. Uniforms aren't required anymore to signal belonging. MAGA hats, Antifa black bloc, yellow vests, these all serve similar functions. They create instant group identity. They allow anonymous collective action. They mark territory visually. Researchers find that people wearing partisan clothing show increased aggression toward opposing groups, even when the outfits are randomly assigned in experiments. The clothes don't just represent beliefs, they actively shape behavior, much as brown shirts did. Economic improvements are still distracted from eroding freedoms. Under the Nazis, unemployment dropped. Wages rose slowly but surely. Massive infrastructure projects dazzled foreign visitors. These surface-level successes bought silence, even loyalty. And even today, some regimes follow the same playbook, offering economic growth in exchange for personal liberty. People accept surveillance for safety, censorship for order. It's an old bargain, one that always feels new. The Faustian deal remains unchanged. Prosperity at the quiet cost of freedom. Societies change slowly until suddenly they don't. It never begins with a bang. No sirens, no alarms, just small moments, tiny shifts. A rule adjusted here, a speech delivered with unusual sharpness there, a protest that receives less coverage than expected, a law passed, then another, quietly, without discussion. Germany, it started with a treaty. A single piece of paper signed in a distant palace, the Treaty of Versailles. Meant to end a war, it quietly began a countdown to the next. Few people noticed. Fewer still understood what it truly meant. But that broken treaty became a broken economy. Reparations, inflation, national humiliation. Bread lines stretched across once proud cities. Families who had known stability suddenly knew only uncertainty. Children grew up too fast, watching their parents break under the weight of something they couldn't name. And from the cracks in that hardship came voices, some loud, some persuasive, some promising that dignity could be restored, that blame could be assigned, and that peace, true peace, required strength, order, and obedience. A broken economy became a broken democracy. The Weimar Republic, imperfect but alive, began to falter. Political bickering, endless elections, empty promises. The people grew tired, weary. They didn't want ideology. They wanted stability. And so, when a figure rose promising strength and unity, many looked the other way. Some even cheered. None of it happened overnight. There were no sirens when books were first burned, no loud cries when journalists disappeared, no drums when neighbors were watched, reported, and detained. The machinery of fear did not start with thunder. It started with silence. The real tragedy isn't the war. It isn't even the camps, though they remain among the most unspeakable horrors humanity has ever created. The deeper sorrow lies in something quieter, something harder to name. It lies in how few people noticed the path they were already walking. Not because they were blind, not because they were evil, but because the road was built in inches, not miles. Because each change came dressed in familiarity. Because every step felt manageable. Because the story didn't begin with smoke and screams. It began with a sigh. The first steps always seem so small. A change in a school textbook. A teacher replaced for reasons that were never fully explained. A new pledge, recited every morning, its words slightly different than before. A symbol added to a building. A joke you could no longer tell. Not because anyone stopped you, but because no one laughed anymore. A friend you hadn't seen in weeks. A newspaper you stopped reading, not because it was banned, but because it no longer said anything true. A neighbor's door, closed more often than it used to be. No one moment felt like a break from the past. Each was just one step further away from what once had been normal. And the compromises, they felt so reasonable at the time. A little censorship because it keeps the peace. A little surveillance because it prevents chaos. A little silence because it avoids trouble. A little conformity because disagreement is exhausting. What's the harm in a unified message after all? Isn't a single voice easier to follow than a crowd of clashing ones? Isn't that better than noise? And so, inch by inch, line by line, day by day, the world reshaped itself. Not in an instant, not with a bang, but with the soft persistence of time. By the time anyone looked up, the horizon had moved, and the ground behind them had disappeared. And now, tonight, as your thoughts grow softer, as your limbs relax, as your body sinks just a little deeper into rest, ask, not with fear, not with urgency, but with calm, steady reflection. What ideas creep into normal life now, unnoticed? What new habits have slipped into our days without question? What small trade-offs seem necessary today, yet might seem heartbreaking in hindsight? What freedoms have we surrendered? Not because we were forced to, but because it seemed easier that way. And what stories will our time tell in the future if we fail to see the quiet bends in the road today? No country is immune. No century is safe. No people are uniquely wise. Liberty is never lost in a single moment. It doesn't vanish like a switch flipping off. It slips away like sleep, one blink at a time. The past doesn't scream. It doesn't flash or flare. It doesn't raise its hand or shake you awake. It whispers, softly, patiently, unfailingly. It offers no easy answers, only gentle warnings, only questions that echo. And it asks nothing except that we listen, that we stay awake just long enough to notice. The choice, as always, is which voices we heed. The loud ones that promise strength, security, and order at any cost, or the quiet ones that ask us to remember, to think, to pause, to be uneasy when things feel too easy, to speak when silence is tempting, to guard what seems unthreatened before it isn't. But for now, there's nothing more to do. You've heard enough for tonight. Let your breath slow. Let the world fall away. You've stayed awake long enough. The world will continue turning, with or without our notice. But perhaps, just perhaps, with eyes a little more open tomorrow. The real tragedy wasn't the war. It wasn't even the camps. Though their horror defies words, the deeper sorrow lies in the quiet path so few noticed they were already walking. The signs were always there, but the pace was so gradual, the shift so small, that each new reality felt manageable. Just another step away from what was once normal. The first steps were invisible, so small you almost missed them. A teacher replaced, a symbol added, a pledge changed, a joke no longer told. A friend you hadn't seen in weeks, a paper you stopped reading, not by choice. Every inch of change was a small compromise, a tiny surrender. What's a little censorship if it brings order, you might have thought? What's a bit of surveillance if it prevents chaos? What harm is there in a single, unified message? These compromises felt reasonable, even necessary. And so, inch by inch, the world reshaped itself. The past does not scream, it whispers. It offers no answers but quiet warnings. It asks only that we listen, that we remember, that we recognize the shape of old shadows in new light. In those moments, it is easy to forget that freedom never disappears all at once. It slips away like sleep, one blink at a time, unnoticed until waking becomes impossible. No nation, no generation is immune. No era is protected from forgetting. Perhaps this is the saddest lesson of all, that liberty is fragile, not because enemies attack it openly, but because we trade it away quietly, softly, for comfort, for convenience, for safety. We do not lose freedom in thunderous revolutions. We lose it in the soft erosion of daily choices. Have you noticed the small things? How quickly did it become normal to trade privacy for convenience? How easily did we accept silence as peace? How often do we mistake order for justice, safety for freedom? The questions are not meant to frighten, but to invite calm reflection, to awaken awareness in the quiet moments before sleep. Look around you now. Where are the invisible walls rising? Where do voices grow quieter, not from fear, but from exhaustion? Where does division slip in? Not from hatred, but from weariness. History does not repeat itself in identical forms. It repeats itself in patterns and whispers. We may not see the same uniforms on the streets, but the shapes of conformity and control can feel just as heavy. The truth is complex. It resists easy answers and simple solutions. Freedom is not the absence of rules, but the presence of choice. It is the courage to question, even when the answers are uncomfortable. It is the grace to listen, even when the voices are different. In the shadows of history, people made choices. Some chose silence, some chose compliance, some chose courage. And that courage came in many forms, not only loud protest, but quiet resistance, gentle kindness, the simple act of remembering. As you settle now into rest, breathe deeply and know this. You carry the power of memory. The stories of the past live inside you, not as burdens, but as beacons. They remind us what was possible, both the light and the darkness. They ask us to look closely, to question gently, to choose wisely. No one asks us to be perfect, only to be present, to notice the small things, to hold the soft truths, to nurture the fragile seeds of freedom. Tomorrow is unwritten. It will arrive whether we watch or sleep. But when your eyes open again, may you see the world anew. May you carry a quiet strength to recognize the subtle shifts, to hold space for difference, to speak when silence grows too deep. Let the past whisper its lessons softly tonight. Let the weight of history settle in your bones, not as fear, but as wisdom. Let your breath slow, your heart soften. The world will keep turning, with or without our notice. But perhaps, with our eyes open, it can turn towards something kinder. Adolf Hitler's life is a story woven with contradictions, of a man who rose from obscurity to shape history's darkest chapter. Born into a world on the brink of upheaval, he carried within him a restless ambition and a fierce desire to be heard. His early years were marked by struggle and rejection. Yet those hardships did not lead him to humility, but to a relentless pursuit of power. His journey was not sudden, but gradual, a careful weaving of words, symbols, and promises that spoke to a wounded nation. He understood fear and hope, and he wielded both as tools, crafting a vision that captivated millions. Yet the life he built was built on shadows, a legacy of suffering, destruction, and loss that reminds us how deeply words and ideas can shape the world. His story warns us of the dangers when one voice grows too loud and when the quiet whispers of conscience are ignored. As we reflect on his life tonight, let us remember not only the horrors, but also the fragile choices that allowed them to unfold. Let his story be a mirror, a chance to see how each of us holds the power to shape our world through vigilance, kindness, and courage. Rest now, carrying this awareness gently in your heart. The past lives within us, urging us to choose wisely, to speak softly but firmly for justice, and to protect the fragile light of humanity. The stars above you don't know time. They burn the same way they did centuries ago. Quiet, indifferent, enduring. And perhaps that's what makes the human story so fragile. Because unlike the stars, we forget. We forget how slowly history happens. We forget that big things don't begin big. They begin as whispers, as feelings, as habits. The first time you accept a lie, it's not because you're convinced. It's because it's easier. Because questioning it is tiring. Because someone you trust repeats it. And maybe deep down, it feels better to believe than to wrestle with the doubt. That's how untruth seeps in, not with shouts, but with sighs. And what about kindness? It fades too, not from malice, but from fatigue. A day that's too long. A moment where you choose convenience over care. A post you scroll past instead of checking on the person behind it. And slowly, the world becomes just a little colder. Not because anyone chose cruelty, but because warmth takes effort. And we're all so tired. That's how silence wins. Not from fear, but from exhaustion. So many in history didn't fall asleep at the wheel. They just closed their eyes for a moment. And when they opened them again, the road was gone. But tonight, here with me in the quiet of your room, you have a chance to open your eyes inward, to ask, when was the last time I paused before agreeing? When was the last time I asked, why do I think this? Who benefits from my certainty? Because sometimes certainty is just comfort in disguise. And in times of uncertainty, we crave comfort more than truth. That's why the most dangerous ideas don't wear dark cloaks. They wear smiles. They promise ease. They promise unity. But freedom isn't the absence of conflict. It's the ability to hold it together, to disagree and still belong, to question and still be trusted, to change your mind and still be loved. We're not taught how to hold that kind of space because it's hard. But maybe that's where real strength lives. Not in the clenched fist, but in the open hand. And in the quiet breath between hearing something painful and choosing not to strike back. History shows us what happens when we forget, when dissent becomes disloyalty, when difference becomes threat, when us and them becomes a permanent wall. And walls can be physical, but more often they're emotional. They're the wall between you and a friend who thinks differently, the wall between generations, between strangers on a bus, on a feed, in a crowd. And those walls are easy to build, brick by brick, comment by comment, silence by silence. But they're harder to tear down. It starts with one choice: to stay soft in a hardening world. That's not weakness. That's resistance. You don't need to be loud to resist. You don't need to be angry. You can simply remain human in places where others forget how. That's what history needs from us most. Not more outrage, not more division, but memory. Not the kind you read in textbooks. The kind that lives in the body, that says, I've seen this shape before. I know this silence. This looks too familiar. Because repetition isn't coincidence. It's invitation to respond differently, to notice sooner, to whisper no before the shout becomes law. So rest now, not in fear, but in awareness. The world will continue to change. There will be new leaders, new slogans, new causes. But the pattern underneath, that will be old. And if we stay soft enough, clear enough, awake enough, we might just shape it differently this time. And maybe when someone asks, decades from now, how we responded, we'll be able to say, we didn't fall asleep. We didn't ignore the small things. We listened. We remembered. And we chose gentleness over ease, complexity over simplicity, freedom over comfort. So breathe now. Let your lungs rise and fall like the tide. Let the noise of the world dissolve behind you. You've done enough for today. The past has spoken. The present has paused. And the future? It's waiting, just beyond the edge of sleep. But it's watching. And now, so are you. Good night.